Welcome, listeners, to the very first episode of the very first season of my debut podcast, History Rewritten. I'm the host, Nick Johnson, and I'm super excited to get this podcast rolling here. So this has kind of been in the makes for some time now, and I've always considered using my historical background to essentially formulate some kind of podcast one way or another. The topic was always kind of up in the air, but I had a plan and an idea and some concepts put together to get one of these podcasts going, but I just didn't really have that one topic that stood out. Well, barring all of the current event issues related to social injustice and all of the police brutality and everything that's going on right now in the United States, of course, we're seeing it all over the media, social media, entering the sports world a bit, and primarily just all the protests and the rioting going on. I felt that I had finally found appropriate direction I wanted to go with the podcast that I was going to make. So I decided to make History Rewritten about basically telling all of the certain information, events, and different concepts throughout history from the side of the oppressed and shedding light on the situation of the oppressed. I'm going to start this initial episode by giving a little bit of background about myself, giving some background about the overall podcast and how History Rewritten will be directed in the future, and where it'll go, what kind of topics we'll discuss down the road, and what we're going to discuss about right now. And then, of course, I'm going to highlight and kind of summarize, before we jump into all the information, what this initial episode is going to be about. About me. I am Nick Johnson, like I said before. I'm the host of History Rewritten, the podcast you're listening to right now, and I am 22 years old, a white male. I attend the Minnesota State University Mankato. It is June of 2020 currently, and I'm set to graduate in December of 2020 with a Bachelor of Science featuring a history major, economics minor, and a business administration minor. So I want to kind of use my studies within this podcast to formulate and direct this down a certain path. I'm going to draw on some things economically speaking, primarily historically, but kind of intertwine all of my studies together to provide you guys with knowledge about these major and super important topics that are going on right now and have been going on for hundreds of years. Prior to my current major and educational path, I was a secondary education social studies major along with the history major. So I have about 2 years of studying towards teaching. I was going to attempt to be a teacher in middle school and high school. I decided to take a change of direction when it came to my college. I just dropped the social studies education major and decided to just go with the history and then pick up a couple of more business related minors. But enough about that. I want to use and utilize my experiences and methodology that I did pick up while taking courses and kind of going along that path of teaching within college to kind of direct and portray those methods onto this podcast, and hopefully by doing that I will be able to deliver a more solid, efficient, and well-constructed podcast for everyone. So continuing on about myself, I am culturally and ethnically American. I'm a Minnesotan. I'm from a small suburban town of the Twin Cities, and then ethnically I am primarily French and German of descent. So without a doubt, I am very much so a white privileged male that grew up in a very small town with a lot of unchecked biases and perspectives about how the world works and worked. I would say that I have 100% shed a lot of those biases and the structure that I grew up in, and I feel much more mature and confident in my ideologies and who I am as a person and how I view politics and the economy and social structures and things like that. I'm a lot more open-minded, you could say, and accepting of a lot more things now. But that's just a little bit about me to give you an idea of who I am. I guess I'll also throw in there too that when it comes to the political atmosphere, I skew left on the spectrum. I am undoubtedly a liberal and vote Democrat primarily. The only thing I would say I'm slightly moderate on when it comes to politics is certain economic policies, but I would say that the democratic concepts and policies usually overshadow that. I would say the economy isn't the most important thing that we need right now. I would say the equal justice and fairness and right to a successful and happy and healthy life is far more important. So the civil needs and the human rights thing is more of what I want to see happening politically in the United States at this moment. But so yeah, that's me. That's who I am, and that's just something to hopefully help you guys understand kind of what side and what perspective I'm going to be taking on a lot of the issues I will be discussing with all of the listeners in here. I will now talk about what History Rewritten is about, where it's going to go, and kind of the general concepts that I've decided to work with and the structure I wanted to use with this podcast. To start, I'm going to use what I would call mini seasons in a sense, and what I mean by that is I'm going to drop probably an episode bi-weekly. So if I can stay on track for that, I'll make these mini seasons about 5 to 10 episodes long about one major topic, and then I'll probably take a little bit of a break before our next mini season and go into more the other topics somewhat related. So the first season we're going to be working on here at History Rewritten is going to be about African American oppression within the United States. So that is going to be the primary focus. We're going to touch on things down the road like the economic disparities, the police brutality, the political atmosphere, and how that is geared and how that sheds light on a lot of the inequalities within the United States. That's what we're talking about initially, including this episode today will be a part of that. Down the road, we're going to look at things like the Hispanic and Latino oppression within the United States, Islamophobia, and the way the Western world views a lot of Arabic and Muslim countries. And then also we're going to talk about things like genocide, mistreatment of certain populations and groups during colonial era. We'll look at things like Vietnam and the current issues going on in Hong Kong and just things like that. Those will be later mini seasons in a sense down the road. Each episode will be roughly an hour long. I want to keep it short, sweet, to the point, enough information that you really get something out of it, but also keep it within a range that you can maintain a fair amount of time and attention towards it without it just being overwhelming and too much, like you have to set aside a certain amount of time to tune in and listen whenever I drop an episode. I will be utilizing iTunes and YouTube for my posting, so if you want to, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel of History Rewritten. It's brand new, just made, so it's not a lot going on there yet, but I have linked in a bunch of different websites and petition sites that you can go to. You can donate to these organizations, and I'll kind of be updating these links and adding more as we progress through these mini seasons, and as I cover certain topics, that's when I'll add more links in for that. So right now there's about a dozen major organizations and websites that you can go petition on, donate to, and they're about like providing things for African American peoples within the United States. A bunch of different great sites if you want to go check those out. Also, if you don't even want to donate, they're really great sites to just educate yourself on a lot of the information that they have to provide and give you a more full understanding of what's really going on and what their mission is to maybe help you just understand and change some of your perspectives. That's also essentially the goal of this podcast and what I want to do on my end. I want to give you guys the knowledge and the ability to go out and make change because change is needed right now. And I hope by educating all of you through this podcast, we can maybe, as a group, and all the listeners and myself can utilize it to learn, move forward, and start and initiate change within the United States, because something has to be done about all of the oppression and the problems that we are facing right now as a country. And not only that, but just what the world is facing as well. I mean, this is going on outside of the United States as well, between various populations. And just to maybe take root and really initiate these things could be a big, first of all, no doubt a big step for the United States, but it could also be a big initiative step for the rest of the world, even just because of how looked at and globally viewed the United States is from a lot of various countries. Now I'll kind of tell you about this episode itself. So, of course, what I'm doing right now, I'm kind of laying some groundwork, the background of and everything that we need, that all the listeners and I needed to kind of have out there for you guys to understand just about where I wanted to go and who I am and whatnot, just because it's the first episode and I feel like, learning a little bit about what I am and what my mission is probably important, just to kind of give you that initial understanding and tell you whether or not you want to hang around and maybe listen to this continuously as episodes drop, or maybe it's just a one-time listen type of deal. But hopefully everyone sticks around. But yeah, this episode is going to be specifically about historical events and concepts within the United States that play such a major factor on the current situation we are seeing right now. Because the important thing to remember is the history does play a very large role. Even though some of this stuff happened centuries ago, that doesn't mean that it doesn't still have weight and influence on what's going on in the world right now, and specifically within the United States. I want to provide you that knowledge so you can come in with that ammunition, and when you go out to tell other people what you know, so you can have some stuff to back your opinions and what you have to say in regards to this. This stuff, we're looking at things as far back as the colonial era, the Middle Passage, the Atlantic slave trade. Then we're going to dive into slavery, various events and documents, and basically federal and state rules and laws that were put into place, and acts and various things around the slavery peak within the United States. We're also going to look at, around World War era and that time period and some of the civil rights movement. And then at the end of this episode, we're going to kind of tie all that into what's going on right now. And that will kind of transition us in for the next episode, which will be mostly about stuff going on right now and just kind of breaking down everything and what we're seeing and tying in a little bit more to historical elements, but just kind of openly discussing and getting some insight and info out there about what's happening in regards to police brutality, but beyond that, how social and economic structures are separating African Americans and other minority groups from the white privileged. But yeah, that'll be next episode. But for this one right now, we're focusing on the historical elements that have kind of dug the trench or paved the road, I should say, to where we are right now, and played a major influence in what we're seeing and what we're dealing with as a country and even as a globe to this day. So we'll get into it. I want to initiate this conversation by starting and discussing race, ethnicity, and culture. So, these are things you can look up, just Google them, and, you can find the definition, sure, that's great, but I'm going to kind of softly unravel and kind of open up some more food for thought on these concepts. So we'll start with race. Of course, as most people know, race is a term that we use to define certain physical features. So someone who is African American with what we consider black or brown skin, that's a race. Where I'm Caucasian, that is a different race. That's just two examples, and primarily just to tie in with what we're talking about here anyways, those are probably the two best examples. The important thing to understand about race, and this is very significant here, is race was a term created by European explorers, colonizers, conquerors, who came into various regions of the world as they were going out and exploring, and they used it to separate and differentiate themselves from these new populations and new people they were coming across. That's big because in itself, race is a racist concept, because just the word itself derives from a racist concept. The reason it was created was to separate. It was to make them look different from another group of people, and by them I mean the Europeans. So they created this term so that they could separate themselves from these other people, and it was just because of physical traits and different or unique culture differences. That's big, because that kind of lays the framework for what we soon see to become this snowball effect of discrimination and oppression. Now, ethnicity, that's a choice. Ethnicity is what you wish to identify, but it usually falls in line with a group of people who share similar features, physical features that is, and the key point here is that you share similar ideas and traditions, or you share a culture. That set of traditions and beliefs is what really defines who you are. So when you really look at it, ethnicity often will and can fall in line with a nationality, for example, or just a nation as a whole. So that's what's really funny about race, ethnicity, and culture. Well, it's not funny, but ironic, I guess, is that it's terms that, you help identify who you are as a person, who you are as a group and a community, and kind of establishes a family in a sense. But we seem to ensure that different ethnic and cultural groups, different races, stay separated from each other within the United States. And I think for sure that a lot of these terms are important to know, just so that you can really get a grasp on what makes someone different, and that really, when it boils down to it, it is just these physical features that make someone different. Because I could share a culture with someone who could be Asian, African American, Spanish, Russian, it doesn't matter. I could share a culture with them if maybe we attend the same church, or we go to school together. That's a community, that's a culture in itself right there. And then the other ironic thing that the US has with all of this is how that it boasts this cultural melting pot concept. I'm sure most of you who are listening here have heard of this melting pot concept before, whether it be in high school or just thrown around on social media and whatnot. But that America boasts it because it has many diverse cultures, races, ethnicities, many different people from many different regions of the world. But the thing is they boast it, we're this cultural melting pot that is allowing people to, and I air quote, live out the American dream within this land of opportunity and this great nation. We bring all these people together and they all can strive for a better way of life. Now, that is very, very not true. This cultural melting pot concept only really boasts that American dream, opportunistic way of life for European ethnicities, or I should just say white people. That's what's ironic about all of this. We boast it that we have so many different people, but only a select amount of them are really getting the full, and I quote again, American dream. I, for one, am someone who thinks the American dream is kind of bullshit. I think that, yes, you have this, there's a great opportunity for me to go out and achieve success and, you know, accomplish dreams and become wealthy and successful and live this very happy life. And when I say there's a chance for me, I mean there's a chance for a privileged white male to do this. You can see that often the American dream isn't even achievable for some women. It's not achievable for LGBTQ communities. It's not achievable for Hispanic and Latino communities, and it's definitely not achievable for African Americans. And that's, of course, like I said, the focus here on this one is the lack of ability for African Americans to be able to get to this American dream, have the equality, have the chance to really become successful within the United States. Now, are there African Americans that are successful? Oh, yes, of course. There's a lot within the United States who are. But the sad fact is a lot of the environments, the social constructs, and the way funding and our tax money is allocated really holds down a lot of these poor African American communities where it's essentially inescapable for them to get out of by how we're constructed as a nation and how society really operates. This cultural melting pot is really just a joke. I mean, yes, we do have many different cultures and races and ethnic groups within the nation, but the thing is like I've said, it's really skewed towards one population, or I should say one race, and that is white people. They are truly the only ones who get to take advantage of the full American dream theory. And that's what is such a big issue. I mean, you can't boast how great, honorable, diverse, and how much opportunity is within your country when you're on the scale that the United States is on. The reason I say you can't do that is because you can't give out the perception that we are so great when it's a lie. And on this global scale and global influence level that the United States holds, I don't think they really should be so quick and accepting of the fact that they can spread this lie that we are the land of opportunity and the American dream is achievable by everyone, and anyone could come in here coming from nothing, being dirt poor, growing up with nothing, and they could be the next CEO of the next Amazon or Walmart or, you know, whatever. But the thing is, that's how we portray ourselves to the globe, but the reality is only a select few could do that. And I will tell you right now that most African Americans aren't going to be able to come from nothing, because if they come from nothing within the United States, they're probably, how the system works, they're probably going to get bogged down and stuck where they are because, you know, the education systems are just horrible and poorly funded to them at unbelievable levels within a lot of these communities. A crime rate is high because, you know, it's really one of the only ways to be able to succeed for a lot of these groups of people, you know, selling drugs and stuff like that, just because they're trying to capitalize on their situation. And, you know, you can't blame them for a situation that they were born into and had no control of. They also get bogged down because of the judiciary and prison systems and just how corrections in general operates towards their race and their communities. I mean, you know, we can hash all day, and I will discuss this in later episodes of this mini season, that judiciary and all of the law and the police brutality and whatnot, but I will kind of get into depth within the next few episodes about how flawed our criminal justice system is within the United States, and especially how flawed it is towards African Americans. But yeah, a lot of this current stuff will be wrapped into at the end of this episode and then down the road in the future episodes for this mini season. But I'm going to get into the real nitty gritty historical information that's very, very much so has always held and still holds this grip on the direction our society, our politics, and the economy and our financial situation, the weight that it has on it, and especially on African American people. So I'm going to start with basically when colonial era began and slave trading started. So I'll talk about the Atlantic slave trade and the Middle Passage, and then kind of wrap that into what it means for us today and how it has affected so widely and influenced how things are established, and a lot of this racial profiling and oppression, how it plays into that. So, to begin, slavery entered Africa roughly around the time that agriculture spread and reached all regions of the continent. So, the reason for that is agriculture, without the current modern technology we have now, required a lot of labor. And there was intercontinental slave trading going on between rival tribes and rival nations, but it was primarily criminals and prisoners of war that were being converted into slaves and then put to work for these regions in these agricultural fields and whatnot. It was on a fairly minuscule scale, but it was going on within the continent. That's when you really see the first rounds of slavery within Africa, or I should say more influxed amount of slavery within Africa. But as you'll find out here shortly, it greatly increases. But slavery via the influence of Europe started when Portuguese explorers came into the western coast of Africa and began fighting and capturing Africans to bring back to Portugal as slaves. And when they would be brought back, they would tend to agricultural fields there. They would mine, work on the docks, be servants in houses. And this is kind of around that time when this larger scale concept of race became very prominent. This happened around the 15th century, or early 15th century, when they went down there, a little bit prior to when Columbus's expedition for Spain took place in 1492. But from the get-go, when the Portuguese entered Africa and began getting involved with converting many African people into slaves, right away they were met with heavy, militia-style resistance and warfare. They would fight and defeat with some of their more advanced technologies and whatnot, and be able to take slaves by beating them. But eventually, they were able to bypass a lot of conflict by going to their higher-ups, the people in power and high authority figures within Africa, and putting a significant amount of monetary value on slavery and a significant amount of influence to get them to essentially conduct their own slave raiding and slave conversion methods by paying them in their manufactured goods and technological advancements to these African high authorities so that they could establish successful, prominent nation states and communities to be more prolific on the global scale and for sure on the continental scale within Africa. Eventually, Spain joined the slave trading business in Africa, and just like Portugal, they initially were just bringing them back to Spain to do, like I said before, become servants, porters, miners, small agricultural workers, and so on. Basically, just free labor to drive up economic wealth and financial capabilities within these nations. As time went on, traders in human cargo ships, and yes, that's what they were addressed as, human cargo ships, which were, of course, meant to transport slaves. They began shipping significantly higher amounts of slaves to some of the offshore colonies around Africa and back home. The numbers started to increase, and you started to see small amounts being transported into the Americas, as right around when Columbus landed in the Caribbean and the Portuguese got to Brazil, and Spain also got into the southern modern United States. But yeah, the first significant influx of slave transports came with Sao Tome, which is in the Gulf of Guinea off the western coast of Africa, and it was the first colony that slaves were sent to. By about 1520, so about 30 years after Columbus came over, Portugal was sending 2,000 slaves a year to Sao Tome. And not long after that, the Portuguese began moving thousands of slaves to South America. The primary reason for that was due to the sugar plantations that existed within Brazil and South America. And they saw a huge monetary value on those sugar plantations. And it becomes one of the places where slaves were sent the most because of the significance of how much acreage and how much agricultural gains could be made off of that region. So people who were sent to Brazil that were from Africa as slaves typically came from the Congo and Angola, which is near the western coast, and they were shipped to Brazil, where they carried out labor for what would become the wealthiest sugar-producing region in the entire Western Hemisphere and debatably the world. It was a mind-boggling financial success down there. The sad thing is these African slaves did a significant, pretty much all, but a very significant amount of the backbreaking labor and the hard work that made it so successful. And of course, they were slaves, so they didn't see a single dollar of it. Around this time, Spain was shipping tons of slaves to the Caribbean and Central and Lower North America. So they began pumping slaves in over there to handle a lot of the tobacco and cotton and the wealth and the silver mining and things like that Central and Southern North America and the Caribbean had to offer. Slaves were introduced to the Caribbean in 1518 and to Mexico in the 1520s, and then the English began actually introducing slaves to North America and those British colonies in the United States right around the turn of the 17th century. So late 16th, early 17th, around the year 1600 is when you start seeing Great Britain really become more involved in that Atlantic slave trade. So the New World brought countless acres of work, countless resources to mine, and countless greedy Europeans who demanded to be tended to by servants and have all of their labor handled at no cost at all, other than the shipping of slaves and the buying and transferring of them and providing the basic necessities for them to live. All of this work within the New World meant that there was a need for countless slaves to perform it, and that meant countless Africans were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to handle all the work, and all that work was just simply to line greedy asshole European pockets. Now, on the other end, slaves weren't just coming over here for free. So you see this concept of the triangle trade occurring, which was the slaves were going from Africa to the Western Hemisphere and the New World and the Americas. And the Americas were sending out all of the natural resources, back to Europe, where they could be manufactured into new upcoming goods, new technological elements and whatnot. And the finished product of those manufactured goods were then shipped to the rest of the world and also to Africa, which was kind of that creates that triangle. So the finished products and the new technology is shipped into Africa, also shipped to the Americas as well. But anyways, manufactured final products into Africa, slaves from Africa to the Americas, and then the resources and the raw materials needed to make those finished products were sent from the Americas to Europe. And the goods that were going to Africa were falling in the hands of these powerful high authority figures that were controlling the slave raids and a lot of the trading and a lot of the kidnapping and dismantling of African communities. That's where these goods were going to, and also a significant amount of them were settlers and colonizers that came from Europe that were living within Africa and handling this slave trading and doing their own slave raids and such. So, but we're going to kind of focus in here on that transportation of Africans from Africa itself into the Americas, which we know that as the Middle Passage. Now, I'm sure a lot of you remember talking about the Middle Passage in high school or maybe other gen ed collegiate course history classes or whatever, if you took any of those. They talk about this Middle Passage and briefly what it was and about the transporting of these slaves from Africa to the New World. So we're going to just kind of go, I'm just going to go into detail and kind of hash out what the Middle Passage experience was kind of like for these slaves. So once a slave was captured, they were forced to walk to the western coast. And that varied depending on where they were located and captured from. Typically, they were already close-ish to the coast. I mean, it was still tens of hundreds of miles, but, in some situations, they were walking from interior Africa, which, I mean, that's hundreds and hundreds of miles of walking that they were forced to do to the coast. And once they were there, they wait until these human cargo ships arrived, where they were then sold or handled through these trading companies and moved in to the ships to be shipped over to the Americas. Basically, once the ships got there, they would cram as many Africans onto them as they could. I mean, we're talking about some crazy conditions. They were cramped below the deck in disease-ridden, filthy cargo holds, essentially, within these boats. And most of the time, the people barely had enough room to even sit upright within these. None of them stood, and which meant that they were traveling for 3 to 6 weeks, sometimes more, depending on the weather, in one position, shackled, unable to move, malnutrition, only provided the very, very bare minimums to survive that journey, and they were stuck in these cargo holds. A lot of the people were even stuck for these 3 to 6 weeks, laying down inches from other people and unable to move. I mean, imagine being forced to lay down for 6 weeks and never even being able to stand or stretch or move at all. And then for them to get off the boat on the other end and be expected to pretty much go to work immediately. I mean, that's very damaging and has a huge negative effect on the mental health, physical health, and just can deteriorate the body by putting them through that amount of stress. Not to mention the crews would abuse and were just horrifically cruel to a lot of the slaves. It was so bad on these boats that many of the captured Africans would attempt to starve themselves in order to die. Others would get so fed up they would, spend days in attempt to break their shackles and mount revolts, but it usually ended in the death of a lot of the slaves. early on in the slave trade, when it first initiated, there was a mortality rate on the Middle Passage transport of over 50%. If a ship has 50 slaves on it, over 25 of them were dying on that train, on that passage. I mean, that is just ridiculous when you really think about it. That just for free labor, you're putting these people through hell, and most of them aren't even making it to the other end. Now, eventually, as the slave trade reached its peak, you saw more water, better nutritional food, larger ships, more room, a little bit more freedom to maneuver for the slaves. But, I mean, it was still horrible conditions either way. But it did bring down the mortality rate to 5% on the passage transportation during the peak of slavery. But the thing you got to remember is during its peak, there was way more slaves being transported. From the early stages, you're seeing hundreds maybe annually being shipped. But by the peak, you were seeing tens of thousands being shipped annually to the Americas. And a 5% mortality rate is still a lot of people dying on these journeys because of the volume of captured slaves being sent. But when you look at it as a whole, from the conception until the end of the Middle Passage and the Atlantic slave trade, 25% of all Africans that were transported via the Middle Passage died on the journey. 25% of them. And I mean, we're talking from when it really picked up, the early to mid 1400s when it first initiated, and then within Africa and moving them up to Portugal and Spain, but then eventually to, around when Columbus arrived in the early 16th century, you saw way more slaves starting to be transported from around that time until basically the abolishment of slavery within the United States around 1865. In that time span, 25% of all of those slaves being transported died in the Middle Passage. That's a massive number considering that 12.5 million slaves were transported via the Middle Passage. And I mean, I've got some numbers right here. That's a total of 10,000, a little over 10,000 going to Europe, 472,000 going to mainland North America, 2,763,000 going to British Columbia, 1.3 million going to French Caribbean, 500,000 going to the Dutch Americas, 129,000 going to the Danish West Indies, little over 1.5 million going to the Spanish Americas, 5.5 million going to Brazil, and then 178 more being circulated within Africa itself, but through the slave trade, for a total of 12.5 million. I mean, these are massive amounts of people being uprooted from their lives and shipped to a foreign region to be put to work for people they've never even met before and people who treat them like shit. I mean, for you to do that to an entire group of human beings is mind-blowing. And this is so important because this is where the shitty treatment and the lack of care towards the African American population, the original hatred comes from this treatment. I mean, you truly have to dislike a group of people to put them through what I've just explained. And for white Europeans to do this is unfathomable, and at least for someone like myself, I couldn't imagine, putting any human being through what they were put through. But this shows you where it comes from, because this powerful hatred is passed through generations. I mean, a slave trader during this era is probably going to push very negative ideals and opinions about Africans onto their kids. And I mean, in these times when you typically just fell in line to your family business, these kids weren't questioning, well, these are human beings. Maybe we shouldn't be treating them like this. I mean, it's all they knew. They were born and grew up into this concept of, well, I'm more superior than these people, so therefore my mom and dad are right, and I'm just going to fall in line, and I don't really know the truth and what's really going on. I'm just here to do my job and move these slaves over and whatnot. I mean, that gets carried down generationally, and we're still seeing older generations today carrying on that type of legacy and that type of message and viewpoint of minority groups, and particularly African Americans. That's why I think what's going on today is so important, because the younger generations are really taking an initiative to spark this change and hopefully really derail this very old, very disturbing thought process of just because you're white, you are superior to another group of people. And by reflecting on a lot of this information that I'm telling you, you can kind of see, well, this is, now at least I know that this is where it came from. But you can see that even though it's centuries back, it still has a lasting effect. And you have to acknowledge that had Europe never gotten involved in Africa and pushed themselves within their continent and influenced them and tried to take them over for cheap free labor to line their pockets and give them all this monetary gain, if they hadn't done that, you would not see nearly as much racial disparity within the United States as you do today. Because if they wouldn't have done that, it probably they would have met each other at some point, of course. I mean, that there's no way that Europeans and Africans wouldn't have connected at some point and acknowledged each other's existence and whatnot had this slavery interaction never occurred. But what could have went differently is, instead of conquering essentially one of the groups that Europeans ended up doing by conquering the African people and converting them to slaves, if instead of that, maybe let's hypothetically say that they met each other and decided to collaborate, combine resources, and approach the new world together, and maybe worked with Native Americans and whatnot, which is another topic we will touch on in a mini season later on as well, that colonial times really played a massive role on. But yeah, let's go back to that hypothetical thinking about if they had worked together rather than fought each other. And wasn't much fighting. It was more of European bullying until they got what they wanted and convinced these higher-ups that, through their monetary influence, they could become wealthy as well if they sell their own people out. But if they would have just worked together, you would see much more of a respect today. And if you can't see that would be how it is, then you hold a level of ignorance so high that you truly need to check yourself and understand that you are in the wrong. Because that might come off very aggressive to some people, but the thing is I'm not saying that my opinions are 100% correct and that, I know more than other people do about these issues, because I definitely don't. And I'm, like I said before, I'm a white male privileged human being that came from a small suburban town. I don't know truly what it's like to be an African American and feel oppressed, because I've never been oppressed. But I try to just put myself in other people's shoes and understand what they're going through. And it's just important to look back and understand, and you need to be able to acknowledge, all people need to be able to acknowledge. I mean, history is the story of how we've gotten to where we are. It is telling us the path we took to the exact moment we are in right now. And you have to draw connections and look at major influences on certain events and certain concepts and certain things occurring today and be like, wow, this probably wouldn't be happening if event A wouldn't have happened at this certain date. Maybe the world would be at a lot more peace had Archduke Franz Ferdinand never been shot, and World War I would have never been sparked because of it. And what would the world look like today if that would have happened? There may have never even been a Holocaust if that tension and the certain way events fell in together had occurred differently. It's like if you think about, if I could go back in time and change something, how different the world could be today just by changing that one little thing. I mean, people, they can understand this concept that I'm talking about, but a lot of them are ignorant and choose not to acknowledge it when it isn't about themselves. I'm sure there's people who might listen to this podcast, hear what I'm saying, and still deny what I'm trying to preach about by saying that these events of the Middle Passage, the Atlantic slave trade, and the effects that it holds on Africa as a continent, and the way Europeans treated Africans, people would deny that that doesn't truly have an effect on what's going on with the racial disparities and oppression issues today, because it happened so long ago. Some people, they will still say that. But to them, I just say that the ignorance they hold is far too high, and people like that have settled into their opinions and their way of life far too much, and have not truly went out, gathered the knowledge, grasped an understanding of what's really going on in the world. But we'll kind of double back here and get back on the historical topics and look at, so we were talking about the 12.5 million slaves that were transported via the Middle Passage, and the effects that this had on Africa are very profound. For a soft, bright side, some nations around the African Great Lakes, which are more towards the southeast or just the east in general, avoided, and were kind of able to stay away from both the Atlantic and the Islamic slave trades that were occurring and being unleashed on Africa. Other groups within Africa profited off of the slave trade. The Asante, Dahomey, and Oyo peoples are just a few examples that I've found about profiting off of essentially selling out their own continental kin. They would acquire weapons, new technology, money in exchange for captured slaves. And the reasoning behind this was to construct powerful West African coastal nations and possibly become significant trading entities within the Atlantic as well themselves. From all of this, Africa saw a devastating loss of roughly 16 million people to various slave trades throughout the continent. Multiple millions to the Islamic slave trade and Egypt. But 12.5 to the Atlantic slave trades. And then there was a decent amount going on within the continent itself, primarily from European-controlled regions in those high authority and the kind of up and coming nation states that wanted to be more globally involved. But it was happening within Africa. How this kind of connects to today, even furthermore, is, like we've said, the uniqueness of African ways of life compared to the European typical lifestyle gave the white people a perception that their way of life, along with their technology, deemed them superior and gave them the right to do as they please, essentially, with the African people. Now, the thing is although some Africans would do the capturing themselves and take capturing of their own people, it wouldn't have happened on the scale that it did had European influence never occurred within the region, or at least that type of European influence. I mean, people should not take what I'm saying and look at it like, well, he said it himself. There was Africans capturing their own kin within the continent and selling them out. It wasn't all just Europeans going in there. And if you're thinking like that, you need to listen closely to what I'm about to say. And that is, the Europeans came in and influenced these African people to essentially do their bidding for slavery. Had that influence never occurred, there would have been minuscule amounts of slave trading still going on, but it would have been what I talked about earlier, those criminals and those prisoners of war between rivaling tribes and nations and whatnot within Africa. It would not have been even close to the scale that it was at with the Europeans' involvement. The wealth, influence, and the high demand that, Portuguese, Spanish, English, the Dutch, what they showed up with to Africa was, it was so high and, almost overbearing and threatening, I'm sure. So, of course, these higher authority figures are going to, don't really want to do it, but the gains, economic prosperity, and the reduced threat of kind of being screwed over by these European countries would probably make it worth it for me to get involved with this slave trading. So what I'm saying is, the focal point of that message there is that you need to understand that it was the European influence that made Africans get involved in the slave trading of their own people. Looking at how this has passed a message along and kept oppression alive within our world is that it demonstrates and sets a tone of dehumanization of various races and people just because of their different way of life and their skin color. This pretty much solidifies, puts into stone and lays some framework and foundations that people are different, and therefore it means the ones who are different and lesser capable in our eyes than us can be taken advantage of. And that's exactly what the Europeans did. The dominance by European nations on African peoples has carried over to today and throughout this time through subtle methods of, not really subtle, I guess, because slavery is very prominent and a vastly prolific aspect of what the United States and much of the Americas was built on. But, through the time, this just, it laid that groundwork for racism to thrive and the oppression to take root and really grip in to society in the New World. That transitions us into kind of slavery and post-slavery and some things that went on right around United States independence and up until the abolishment of it, and then some of the important things that took place after the abolishment of it that kind of feeds into and really plays a major role in the point we're at right now in regards to dealing with oppression and discrimination and so on in our society. I would say that the events that took place in the United States from the time of their independence until the abolishment of slavery are probably play the most significant role on the very dangerous opinions and biases that white people hold towards African Americans, and the very disgusting stigma that many political figures and police and people of power hold on the African American population within the United States. Slavery is disgusting, and luckily has been abolished for a long time, but that doesn't mean that the lasting effects of it don't still weigh very heavily on our world to this day. But when you look at slavery, just the horrific sides of the conditions, we all, as Americans, should know about the lynchings and the brutal beatings, the vile and repeated sexual assault of white people on the female slaves, and the dangerous, backbreaking, long, laborious pushing of slave owners onto these slaves when they're out working, and the horrible living conditions, the lack of rights that these slaves held is so significant. And they were pretty much treated as livestock and a tool for economic gain. They were human, but they had no human rights. And that really just shows how strong and massive and widely acknowledged the racism and oppression and widely accepted all of that was during these times. And this mistreatment and way of life that slavery had and held on America and so many other parts of the world is just, it's astounding when you look back on it and think that actually happened. But what also is astounding is the fact that you can look back at slavery and be like, wow, this was so messed up and so disturbing, but people think that when it was abolished in 1865 it just ended, and that is far and so far from the truth, because the lasting impacts, like I've been arguing and pushing all throughout this podcast so far, weigh so heavily on today. And the reason I keep saying that over and over again is because people need to understand how significant these events are when it comes to playing a role in how society operates to this day. And I will say it more than likely as this podcast continues, but people have to understand that it is so important to grasp that the events of slavery still weigh heavily on American culture, American social structure, economic structure, and political structure. But now I'm going to talk about various acts and events and economic aspects that really play in with slavery as well, and this path towards where we are with current issues right now. The first thing I want to talk about is the 3/5 Compromise of 1787. So, in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the 3/5 Compromise was agreed upon, and this was a very significant moment in U.S. history, and especially for African American history, because this allowed slaves to be counted within the political atmosphere. So, despite having no human or civil rights and not technically being a citizen within the U.S., 3 out of every 5 slaves were allowed to be counted in regards to voting, electoral votes, the House seats and Senate seats, and along those aspects. So people who weren't even treated as human beings were being counted for political gain. This is significant because it gives the South much more power and feeds into that rise of Southern capability, economic capability, political capability that you see going up until roughly the Civil War. So 3 out of every 5, that's what the 3/5 compromise means. 3 out of every 5 slaves were counted as one citizen, essentially, or one person. And what that meant for the South was that they gained 1/3 more seats in Congress and 1/3 more electoral votes when it came to presidential elections and Senate and House elections and local government elections and things like that. When you break it down, because they're not treated with human or civil rights and not treated as citizens, technically it would only make sense to not count them at all, because if they don't have any say, why should they be able to be counted for the political gains of someone they most definitely do not align with politically, culturally, socially, and economically? I mean, they're being counted for their slave owners. And I can tell you right now that the slaves did not agree with slave owners' political views and most definitely wanted to be free, of course. So the fact that they had no say in it but were being counted makes it very wrong and just allocates more power to the South because of this. Non-slave states, so these northern states, were accepting of it because one of the other options, essentially, or choices would have been to count each slave as a person for the South, which, if you really break that down and look more in depth at it, would pretty much mean if every slave was counted as one, the South would have had nearly absolute political power within the United States. Overall, this just enabled more political say than the South really deserved, and gave them much more capabilities, politically speaking, and financial dominance in early America's life, and it really kind of sidelined any progression towards the freeing of slaves before the Civil War. And that's the reason I say that, is because the North, even once time progressed and, got more into the early, mid, and late 1800s, you see the North striving more to free African Americans from slavery and abolish slavery, and you see more trends and pushes for their human and civil rights. Not on a full-scale level, because obviously, as we see today, those still aren't even fully equal to that of white people, but those pushes were being made. And this was sidelined because the South had so much say, and they could really shoot down any progression, at least in the political atmosphere, and definitely in the financially, because in America's early life, the South was the economic powerhouse of the country, whereas you see more towards post-abolishment of slavery and the 1900s and urbanization and further industrialization and whatnot, you see the North become that powerhouse. But early on, you see the South as that economic machine that kind of drove the United States' early prosperity. So the 3/5 compromise, that is something important to grasp that has severe weight on how Black human and civil rights progressed throughout our country's history. And it really slowed that progression and put a lot more power and acceptance of slavery within the South, and even more acceptance in general for the North. I mean, it was agreed upon by all parties within the Constitutional Convention, and it was upheld for a large amount of United States history while slavery existed. The other thing I wanted to discuss as well is the Missouri Compromise. So the Missouri Compromise allowed Missouri, which was a part of the Louisiana Purchase, to be a slave state, and then the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase to be free states. And also allowed for Maine to separate from Massachusetts as its own state, and that would become another free state. But the Missouri Compromise also established the 3630 parallel rule, which essentially meant that slave states stay south and free states stay north. This is big because a lot of northern states saw this as somewhat as a victory, because if runaway slaves crossed that 3630 parallel, they were able to remain in the north and stay free and were protected. But because of these, the rest of Louisiana Purchase would be free states. They got Missouri, but we got Maine type idea. And then any runaway slave people could run away or escape through like the Underground Railroad, for example, and get to the north and remain free. But this halted a lot of, or dramatically slowed any more progression, because, northern people kind of settled in and were more accepting because, there's opportunities, and we're kind of out ahead of this slave fight for freedom and rights for slaves, and they were kind of out ahead, so it slowed some things. But then it really backfired when the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 went through, and it essentially rebranded the Missouri Compromise and deemed that not valid anymore. So now you see this being more of a success for the South. It opened up the concept that newly formed states could choose whether they wanted to be a free state or a slave state. And this infuriated a lot of citizens in the North, and it also threw out that 3630 parallel, which meant if runaway slaves escaped to the North, they were still that Southern slave owners' property and had by law needed to be returned to them. So this caused a lot more problems and was kind of a tipping point, along with the Dred Scott versus Sanford case, for the igniter and kind of the sparking of the Civil War. The Kansas and Nebraska Act was a big victory at its time for the South, and it meant that slavery was probably going to survive significantly longer within the United States. But then, of course, as we know, by 1860, the Civil War starts, and eventually the North wins, and the abolishment of slavery occurs. But at this time in 1854, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the South was kind of retook that lead in the disagreements over slavery between the North and the South, and basically opened up that there was that chance that slavery was going to survive a lot longer, and also that racism and the oppression was going to stay at a very strong level within the United States, rather than kind of fizzling down to a little less serious of a level, although regardless still at a very, very dramatic level within the U.S. That is oppression and racism and discrimination occurring. But now I'm going to jump into some economic sides and drop some statistical data and kind of open people's eyes to the monetary side of what was happening with slavery, and primarily these white slave owners within the South. So I found this site. It was called Measuring Worth, and it's a economic website developed by professors at Miami University and Loyola Chicago. So this site pretty much takes into consideration various values of things, decades, centuries, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and puts them into like value in today's money, and an understanding of kind of an economic understanding of the significance of those, and the dollar value significance at that time comparative to today. So, for example, I drew off of the conclusions they found with just general costs and pricing around the year 1850 in regards to slavery. So in 1850, the cost of a slave was around $12,500 to $200,000 in 2016 to 2020 dollar values. So $12,500 would be the cheapest end of a slave. But like I said, that's in today's currency value. So, which means back then that was a significant chunk of change, though, that slave owners were spending for slaves, and with it being upwards of 200,000. But the thing that I'll get into here in a sec is how much money that one slave could make them. So when slavery started, the costs of slaves were significantly cheaper in the beginning, but over time, the average cost, of course, increased. Only naturally it would. And then there also, as time went on, you started to find more of these, what the site used as premiums, or premiums were paid on certain skills and capabilities that the slaves held. So just some examples would be like the age of a slave, the strength of the slave, the health condition, any skill sets they had, maybe when they were living in Africa or that they acquired on a different plantation. So, agricultural background, or maybe a blacksmithing background, or just various elements that would give them any slight edge of value, serving backgrounds and anything like that. And a big one too would be for female slaves, if they were able to bear children and have kids. Premiums would be paid on these things, and you saw that's when that value of the slave, or the cost of them, would start increasing upwards of that $200,000 mark. A significant capability or a premium that was paid for was females who could have children, and that's because you would pay one outright cost, but be able to groom and mold your own slave from a child that they have. And that meant essentially they were getting a 2-for-1 type thing, paying for the female, having her provide another slave, or a child that would become a slave, and then work for that slave owner on a plantation. When looking at this, though, the net value of a slave, or essentially the amount of money they would make in their life for a plantation owner in 1850, was $400. In income value in today's money, that's about $92,000. And that is for the slaves, the cheapest of the slaves. So that in current currency, that $12,500 slave would gross them about $92,000 of income value. And yes, that's after the value, or the factored in elements of the cost of their life and their housing and feeding them and clothing them and whatnot. But the thing we also need to remember is that slaves were usually required to build their own rooming and boarding situations, their own barracks, and also sew their own clothes and cook their own food. The costs that the plantation owner provided were simply just the basic raw materials and resources. So they would provide the food, but they wouldn't cook it for them. They would provide the material and the cloth, but they wouldn't sew the clothes. They might provide the lumber. They might make the slaves go out and cut it down themselves, that they could use to build their homes, essentially, or their living quarters while they're on a plantation. The requirement to purchase and transport and move slaves between various and different plantations decreased over time because of these child slaves and children who were born on plantations and molded into slaves for them. That decreased the overall need to buy, because they were able to just exploit slave families for labor. You look at these numbers and how this website explains it, and this is talk that definitely occurred back in the peak of slavery. This is how much this slave could probably get me, and this is how much I paid for it. And now you're talking and treating them as livestock, which is really what their lifestyle was equivalent to. They were just treated as a tool, and a means to economic gain. They like I said before, they had no rights. They had no say in their own life other than maybe to run away, but that usually would end in brutal punishment and often death. Really, when it boils down to it, slave owning was a capability of primarily higher status people or wealthier people, but that meant more money and more power and more influence by the ruling class. And that's when we could, and this will be discussed in later episodes as well, but I could get into a whole ordeal about how, although America drives itself on all of its people and all people are important to the economic prosperity and the capabilities of this country, but how much political sway and just influence the wealthiest of people in this country truly have. I think a lot of people don't really grasp how influential and how powerful, just how powerful like in modern society, that top 1% really has on the type of grip that it truly has on American society. And once again, you see it back here during slavery, that high status, essentially that era's 1 to 5% wealthiest people played such a significant role in American history, that because if it's true that only higher status people own slavery, but an entire war was fought over slavery within the U.S., then that should tell you right there just how powerful those people were, because it was so difficult to get rid of slavery and abolish it that it took a war to accomplish that. But when going back to the that slave owning was a higher status thing, the important element of this is that the average cost of slaves were equivalent to that of a second average sized home at the time. And a cool little thing that I found on that Measuring Worth website was that $400 in 1850, 1860, that around that time period, which was the net value of a slave, would have purchased 4,800 pounds of bacon, 3,000 pounds of coffee, 1,600 pounds of butter, and 1,000 gallons of gin. Obviously, that wasn't a standard shopping list of people back then, but that just puts into kind of materials and resource aspects and just how much the worth a slave held to these owners and how much that $400 that they were earning their owners could really buy, and the type of luxury it could produce. So the real price of $400 from 1850 to 2016 is the year I have here is $12,000. So $400 equals roughly $12,000. And real price, of course, isn't a great measuring tool when looking at this, because there's so many outliers and so many different influences on the slave and the cost of living. And of course, different owners had various treatments and various methods of running their plantations and handling their slaves. But the thing to remember is, I said earlier, well, they would have to cook their own food and sew their own clothes and build their own homes. But the cost for slave owners and plantation owners of that wasn't very high, because oftentimes the food was grown right on the plantation. Timber and wood and resources were usually in abundance around the area for them to go and chop down and use for construction purposes. And then, of course, cotton is used for clothing. So on the bulk of these cotton plantations, the material to sew clothes was provided right then and there for the slaves to have to sew themselves. So, if done in that manner, essentially speaking, when you really look at this here, one slave in itself could make a plantation owner a hell of a lot of money. so much money, and that's why they became so wealthy, was because of what the slaves really brought to the table in value, but were never treated even close to that value. And to put it into some perspective, only that those high status people owned slaves, but slaves made up 47% of the South's population and 29% of the Upper South's population, right around the end of slavery. So that itself shows you the economic power and capability that the South and these people of power held. And this is just so important to look at, because it really wraps in with and shows that slaves, I mean, when you see people say that slaves broke their backs and were the labor and the driving force behind what America is now, I mean, that is so true. They made up a huge amount of the population within the United States and truly built this country for white people. These white of European descent people, they just reaped all of these monetary benefits that the slaves did all the work for. So, you know, if you, a lot of white people today, they pride themselves on the fact, well, you know, me and my family lineage, we built everything we had in this country and earned every dollar we had in this country to get to where we are right now. That's why I don't want to give up my hard-earned money to people who can't, to people of the poor, and it's things like that. You hear a lot of that today. But if you're going to argue that the hard work, determination, and hard-fought battle for your economic prosperity within your family lineage is, if you're going to use that as an excuse to knock down why you shouldn't be paying higher amounts of taxes or giving more money to people in poverty and minorities who are not treated equally, if you're going to use that as an excuse, then really how American society should be constructed, it would be that African Americans would hold far more economic power within the United States than that of most white people whose lineage belongs within the South of the United States, because they didn't really do the backbreaking work. They didn't really earn anything. Sure, they established the plantation and headed the operations of the plantation, but the slaves are the ones that did all of the work. So if white people, whoever might have that bias or think that way, if that's how you think, and if you listen to anything I just said, then the money that is coming out of your paychecks for taxes and going to people of poverty, and primarily to poor African American communities, that is exactly where hard-earned money should be going, because they were the ones who busted their ass throughout slavery and didn't see a penny of it, and they're the ones whose families really built America, not the people who claim they do. And that's where the ignorance and the hypocrisy of the United States really drops in and comes in at such a great level and such a high level within the U.S., because it is completely hypocritical to make these statements that I deserve all of this money because me and my family have worked so hard for it. Well, you know, their families worked so hard back in slavery, but because of the complete oppression, discrimination, and economic disparities and mistreatment and the rules and laws and the way slavery operated and how it cut them totally off from any type of economic gain, and by them I mean the African American slaves, that they didn't have control over, and they're in poverty today because of how their family lineage has been cut off. And white people are in the position to make money today because of how their family lineage took advantage of that African American population in order to set themselves up financially. So it's really kind of messed up, because when you look at it, the people who did all the work saw none of it and are poor, and the people who just sat back and reaped the benefits of it are the ones who get all the opportunities today. And that's not fair whatsoever. And yes, you're going to argue that, okay, well, that's what my previous family did. Me right now, I have nothing to do with that. I didn't do anything. I'm not, maybe even not even discriminatory of or racist of African Americans or racist in any way. That may be true, but the bottom line is you have to acknowledge your privilege that your ancestors and your family lineage provided for you by taking advantage of these people. And since no other generation has taken any efforts to truly make change besides African Americans during the civil rights movements and any of their white allies that they had during that time, that's really the only great push we saw and have seen until really this year in 2020, when we've seen all these protests in regards to police brutality and economic inequality and things like that. But now we need to acknowledge the history, acknowledge the privilege, and use that to make changes and balance out all of the inequality and all of the social injustices that we see. Because if we can't do that, the younger generations who are fighting so hard, if we can't do that, then we need to at least establish so that the generations below us can learn off of what we have initiated and do it in the future. Because with our generation, we have to fight to make that change, but there's going to be a lot of backlash from older generations who were born into heavily oppressive, discriminatory, segregated, and racist times. Because a lot of the older generations who are in power right now, they were very much youthful and alive and ignorant during the civil rights movements and previous to that, when racism was still full blast in America. I would still say it's full blast today, but you just see more closeted racism than anything, but it's still there. And the social issues and the effects of that closeted racism still exist, because it falls in to employers not hiring African Americans, the criminal justice system charging and sentencing African Americans at a higher rate for longer sentences than that of white people. And you see it in just the poverty-ridden communities that lack funding and lack resources to better themselves. And because of that, the mentality and all of the methods and ways and opinions that these older generations hold have to kind of be broken down, and hopefully the younger generations can kind of open their eyes to what this closeted racism and blatant, outright visual racism that 150% goes on still as well, what that means, and if we can break that apart and kind of open their eyes to what it's really doing, which is what I'm trying to do with this podcast, then maybe the younger generation can spark change. But as brutal and honest and aggressive as this may sound, change may not come until many of those older generations have kind of gone away, because once you're at that age, I would imagine that you kind of settle into your opinions, your biases, and your perspectives, because you've seen things a certain way your whole life, and you're not really going to be willing to change when you're up in that age column of 60s, 70s, 80s, and sometimes even the generations that are still only 40 or 50 years old. But it's taken root in them, but I think change has taken root in the younger generations, and a lot of that can be accredited to the want for younger generations to pursue further knowledge and the access that social media has provided to easily pursue further knowledge and understanding of how the world works and that interconnectedness that we see within the world. Older generations weren't very interconnected globally, where we can, within minutes, be in contact with somebody on the opposite side of the planet. And that makes for a lot more understanding and a lot greater acknowledgement of other people and their ways of lives and respect for that and their cultural traditions and their beliefs and things like that. But after the abolishment of slavery, it did not stop there. I'm going to kind of jump in here to a lot of important post-slavery elements that really, really feed into oppressive concepts and racial issues and social injustice from the late 19th century all the way until modern day. Just because slavery ended, and I've said this before as well, but just because slavery ended doesn't mean that the repercussions of it ended with it and died with it as well. There were still legal loopholes and methods that a lot of states and even to some degree the federal government were able to discover and kind of almost perform legal slavery, but segregation and discrimination and things like that were all legal oppression that they were able to loophole and find and utilize once slavery was abolished. So while slavery existed, the South, of course, dominated the U.S. markets and was the primary income source of the nation. But after the abolishment of slavery, that's when the North began to surpass, a little bit before it as well, but really when slavery ended, because the free labor was gone, and now a lot of these plantation owners had to perform the work on their own or hire on these slaves back and pay them wages and allow them to leave the property afterwards and go back to their homes, and they didn't really have any control, not nearly as much control over them as they did when they were slaves. And I would say the nail in the coffin for the transition to the North economic dominance from what was previously the South's economic dominance, the nail in that coffin is when the Great Migration in the early 20th century occurred. And when millions of African Americans migrated north to work in factories and moved to the northern cities, Chicago, New York, Boston, Detroit, Minneapolis and St. Paul, Milwaukee, places like that. They moved north from those previous slave states, and that Great Migration was kind of that nail in the coffin to any South economic dominance. But now I'm going to talk about, hands down, the most influential and important post-slavery event, system of events, and just general construct in the U.S. society. And that's going to be what are known as the Black Codes. Also, many people might know them or refer to them as the Jim Crow laws. So the Black Codes, this is hands down one of the most influential elements when speaking on general U.S. history that plays a massive role in how today's society is set up in regard to African American life. So it was a set of codes and laws established throughout southern states in 1865 and 66, primarily in those, and so right after the end of the Civil War and right after the abolishment of slavery. These were altered, changed, kind of fluctuated throughout the rest of the late 19th century and most of the 20th century. So these were laws put in place to control the African American population and do things such as deduct wages, destroy any capability of living out that American dream that we talked about before, and basically keep them subsided and lesser than white people still. Now, I said these were passed right after the abolishment of slavery and right after the end of the Civil War. But what's so crazy about them is they were segregated laws, essentially legal slavery in some ways. As I get into more detail here, you'll understand that. And really just horrifically oppressive. And they lasted until 1964, until the passing of the Civil Rights Act due to the Civil Rights Movement. These existed for 100 years within the United States. And having that exist this long when it's literally legal oppression, legal discrimination, segregation, legal racism in a sense, having that exist for 100 years on top of the couple hundred years of existence of slavery within the colonial U.S. or colonial America and then the United States once it was created. That combination, and then us being in 2020, only being 60 years from when this ended, should tell people how much more work we have to do, because 60 years is not even a whole lifetime and only 2 to 3 generations roughly of people being born and people passing within the United States. I'm going to jump into more specifics on these black codes now and give you some examples in different states during the South, and especially like right when they were formed. But this will show all the listeners and kind of tell you guys how they pretty much got through so many loopholes after the abolishment of slavery to be able to hold down the African American population within the United States. So for an example, Mississippi had a law that required African Americans to have written evidence of employment, and most of their forms of employment, or the only employers that would hire them, would be contracted work. Evidence of employment, then they would have to forfeit earnings or be arrested. This was formed right after the abolishment of slavery. The fact that if they didn't have this, or they broke any form of their contract, which usually the contracts drafted by these white employers were at reduced wages, and it would tie them in some way that would most definitely be illegal today into these contracts. And if they didn't follow those or have written evidence of employment on them at all times, they could be arrested, or they would have to forfeit paychecks. The big kicker for this was that a lot of slaves were illiterate. They couldn't read or write during slavery. As it progressed, it got a lot better, and eventually most of them could. Well, not most of them, but some of them could. And a lot of these white people, after the abolishment of slavery, they would not provide this written proof of employment to a police officer if they asked this African American for it, or whatever. A lot of them wouldn't present it because they would just say, well, that African American citizen is supposed to have that and possess that on them at all times. This would often allow them to be taken to jail or forfeit earnings, which would only hurt their economic status even more and damage any chance they had of becoming more successful or more wealthy at all within the United States. And this happened to a lot of African Americans. Another example would be in South Carolina. They did not allow any African Americans to hold any profession other than a farmer or a servant unless they were willing to pay an annual tax ranging from $10 to $100, which was a ton of money at that time. So if they wanted to be anything other than a farmer, which at this time, being a farmer meant being a sharecropper underneath a white landowner, so they would have to buy a portion of that owner's land and pay them a tax in crop to that owner for using their land. So sharecropping, essentially, or being a servant or working in a white person's house were the only jobs that an African American could hold in South Carolina unless they paid that annual tax. And most of them had no money to their name at the abolishment of slavery, of course. And even for years after that, they had no money, and definitely not enough to pay a $10 to even $100 annual tax in order to do a different profession. Along with this, within the South, African Americans could only take people to court or testify in court if it was against somebody or with somebody of their own race. And that was a primary one in South Carolina too. So a crime committed by a white man against a black man, that black man could not take them to court because it wasn't against another African American. And there was an entirely separate court system for African Americans. The only time an African American appeared in court with white people was when white people were charging the African American with crimes against them. That's the only time. So they can never take any white person into court for them committing crimes against them or their family or their property or anything like that, which is clearly skewed so heavily because often the African Americans weren't committing crimes against each other or even at all, but a lot of whites were sexually assaulting African American women or murdering African Americans, and that was a common thing, but they could never be tried for it because most police or other white people weren't going to come forward and do anything about this, and the African Americans couldn't take them to court for it. So also in South Carolina, African Americans could buy property and could marry, but property was usually restricted within regions where the land was difficult to have successful harvests on, and basically only the worst of land was available for sale to the African Americans. Within a lot of southern states, you also had these apprenticeship laws, which meant that African American orphans or black children who were deemed unfit and are children of those who were deemed unfit. So parents who were ruled by the state unfit to raise a child, the children were taken from them and subjected to these apprenticeship laws, which meant that they would be sent into quote unquote as an apprentice to a white person, and that white person would be liberating them from this worse lifestyle that they had before and being able to put them to work for no paid labor. It would be unpaid labor for white landowners. So when you really break this down, it's not only is it a violation of child labor in today's laws, but at that time, it's essentially legal slavery because they're not paying the children anything, but they're working their land for them, which is exactly what slavery was. But this was just illegal because courts or police or people in the community would deem African Americans often unfit to raise their children. And if you look into a lot of these apprenticeship laws even more, you can find things that a lot of these parents were wrongfully accused of mistreatment of their kids. And of course, a lot couldn't be done for the orphaned kids because their parents were either gone or deceased. So they were kind of stuck to that apprenticeship system. But the kids who were taken from their parents, a lot of the time these parents were not, the reason they were deemed unfit is because they couldn't provide for them. And the reason they couldn't provide is because the economic system of the South and the United States in general was so skewed to the white. And like I said just prior to this, a lot of if they owned land, it would be the worst land that it would be difficult to have successful harvests, or they would be sharecropping and whatnot, or they'd be hired at reduced wages and things like that. But these parents were good parents, of course. It's just that they couldn't financially provide for their children, and then a lot of these states, primarily South Carolina, would deem them unfit to raise their children and then send them into these apprenticeship laws, which is essentially legal slavery. There's also a thing called vagrancy in a lot of the southern states, which meant vagrancy is kind of like an adult apprenticeship system, where it was those who were arrested would be outsourced or sent to work off, in quotes, their crimes as an unpaid worker for primarily a white landowner on their property, typically like a cotton or tobacco plantation. And they would be sent to serve their sentence for these landowners, which is also basically a form of legal slavery. For a comparison, whites who fell under this sentencing of vagrancy, they usually just had to forfeit some of their property or sign an quote, and I quote, oath of poverty, which meant that they would be stripped of a large amount of their possessions and have to take on a life of poverty for some time. Other crimes and punishments that were unfair would fall into this vagrancy would be rebellion, arson, robbery, assaulting a white woman, etc. These were crimes that most southern states deemed were most likely to be committed by an African American. So they picked out the crimes that, statistically speaking, African Americans committed the most and made vagrancy the primary punishment for it or sentencing for it, which meant they found that loophole to get African Americans essentially back into slavery. Also, a lot of these crimes, if they weren't sentenced to vagrancy, it was you typically punished by death then instead. And when looking at this, how I said a white person would forfeit some of their property or sign an oath of poverty, if it was to an extreme or a similar extreme where an African American would have gotten the death penalty, then a white person typically would not. So, for example, when an African American man sexually assaulted a white woman, let's say, then often they would get the death penalty. Where if a white man sexually assaults an African American woman, then they would not. Well, typically with that court system, a lot of time it would go unchecked if it was towards an African American woman, because that woman couldn't take them to court. If a white man sexually assaulted another white woman, then they usually wouldn't get death, but they would get that vagrancy or some kind of other punishment that was far less severe than that of an African American would get. Across the board, there was just really endless restrictions in so many different forms that limited any kind of success, any kind of stride for equality that African Americans were trying to get, or any chance of them putting themselves on a similar financial, economic, and power level that whites were on. These black codes or Jim Crow laws are really the foundations for segregation and are the laws they are the laws that are put into use in states to create segregated schools and segregated buses and segregated work areas and things like that. The Jim Crow laws are just branches of these initial black codes, and all part of the same program that was legal for 100 years within the United States. And like I said before, they went right up until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which then made all of these black codes or Jim Crow laws illegal, and the mistreatment of African Americans illegal on a discriminatory level and segregated level, at least. I'll dive into a few more inner aspects of kind of the lifestyle and the economic things that happened after the abolishment of slavery for African Americans. So, like I said before, sharecropping was a primary profession of the newly freed slaves. African Americans who sharecropped would pretty much go oftentimes to their previous slave owner, purchase a portion of their land, and then sharecrop or harvest it and pay a tax in the crop that they harvest to the overall landowner, or that which was typically always a white landowner. And they would pay, often the landowners would place a very high fee on the crop, and the tax that would have to be paid each harvest would often go, it would fluctuate up and down a lot, typically getting higher as time went on, because they would try to take more and more advantage of these African American sharecroppers who are harvesting what was once their land, though the white landowners all of their land. But often these high fees and taxes on the crop would slowly depreciate the African Americans' capability to make any money. That's if a poor growing season didn't damage or destroy it already. There was usually no insurance from the white landowners or the states on their sharecropping. And if there was a poor growing season, then the white landowners would tend to take more from the African Americans in that crop fee, which would leave most of the time the black sharecroppers barely had enough crop to just feed themselves, let alone sell it and make any money. If sharecropping debts piled up or contracts were unfulfilled, then often you would see it go back to these vagrancy laws, or along with being charged with a crime within or on the property of that landowner while they're sharecropping or whatnot, or just in general, then it would go back to those vagrancy laws I talked about before. And that's also known as peonage. And that would be, which is essentially legal slavery, besides technically it being outlawed in the U.S. in 1867. So yes, technically speaking, peonage was outlawed in 1867, but it realistically carried on into the 20th century. And when you really look at it, it is even seen today in the U.S. justice system. So in the criminal justice system, you can be sentenced to community service, which is essentially what peonage means. Peonage is the working off of a crime or an unpaid debt without any, so you wouldn't be paid at all. You would work something off that you owe someone. So a debt, or if you didn't fulfill a contract of employment, or like I said, if you were charged with a crime. And in modern U.S., you can be charged with community service, which is modern day peonage. And who today is most likely to be incriminated, that would be African American people. So peonage and the use of it on African Americans still exists to this exact moment. But since around the civil rights movement, it has just moved to a judicial and a criminal use strictly, rather than it being like an employment or a contract or a payment of debt use. So when you look at those sharecropping debts that would maybe put somebody into peonage, or these unfulfilled contracts and whatnot, then a lot of the times you would get they were skewed to end up having to, and they would be utilized. This peonage would be almost always just put to use on the African American population. A lot of white people wouldn't pay off debts in this manner. Typically, you would, in their contracts, if they weren't able to complete it or didn't pay off a debt, they would just get an extension of time to do it. Let's put it into an example. So a white person would have a poor growing season, and let's say they owed a certain amount of crop. to another person, and they weren't able to get it because of the poor growing season. Well, that other white person would probably look at them and say, well, it was a poor year, and there's not really much you could do to control that, so I'll give you another year extension to make that up with next year's harvest. Now, if that happened to an African American because of poor growing season, then they would be demanded to find the money somehow as soon as possible, and if they couldn't, then they would be turned into the police. The fact that this system still technically exists is written, physical, modern proof that the results, all of these historical events that I've been talking about, still plays a role today. This is written in print in our society right now. We can physically see that all the time, although you can physically see all of the injustice and racism going on as well, especially with the use of social media and just the internet in general. It really exposes us to all of it. But I'm going to talk about now something that most of us probably have heard at some point, but just never really looked into in depth, which we're going to do here, and that's the 40 acres and a mule concept. So most people, if you reflect on your education, you were told that this is what happened after slavery was abolished. All of the African Americans were given 40 acres and a mule to begin their new freed lives. If you remember, and I need to reiterate what I just said again, we were told that absolutely happened. And this is when I really got to college and learned more about 40 acres and a mule, did my own research on it and whatnot. I was kind of mind blown because I just always remembered hearing that it did happen. Well, yes, it happened for a very limited amount of time. It was written up, discussed, put into action, and taken away just as quickly as it was made up. So what I'll say is, at first, before we dive into all that, I'm going to discuss what the 40 acres and a mule concept actually was and what it meant. So it was introduced by General William Tecumseh Sherman, or as you guys might better know him, or event you might know him from, was when Sherman did his March to the Sea during the Civil War, which was one of the major events that kind of helped put the war to an end. But he and some other people drafted up the 40 acres and a mule concept for all of the freed African American slaves within the U.S. So I kind of found some summarized versions of the three sections that it was made up of, and I'll quote them from what the original documents actually said, just some minor pieces that really hammer home the points in each section. So in section 1, it says the islands from Charleston south, the abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back from the sea, and the country bordering the St. Johns River, Florida, are reserved and set apart for the settlement of the Negroes now made free by the acts of war and the proclamation of the President of the United States. So the first section discusses the land that was set aside in the 40 acres and a mule concept for African Americans to live on and start harvesting crops and living their own lives. Section 2 says, on the islands and in the settlements hereafter to be established, no white person whatever, unless military officers and soldiers detailed for duty, will be permitted to reside, and the sole and exclusive management of affairs will be left to the freed people themselves. By the laws of war and orders of the President of the United States, the Negro is free and must be dealt with as such. Section 2 is mind-blowing because we were told 40 acres and a mule happened, but if that was the case, essentially states in which only African Americans could live would have been established within the United States in the South. That's what Section 2 of the 40 acres and a mule original concept was for. They were going to establish African American only regions or states where no white person can reside, and the only people who could have any white people who could have any kind of influence in there is military officers, and it would have been for primarily the protection of them. So if 40 acres and a mule would have lasted, that would have been groundbreaking in the establishment and essentially the pushing for equality of African Americans, because they would have had their own communities, their own places to reside without any white people really getting involved and having major negative impacts on their lives. Also, I've seen and heard of theories of if that would have happened, there probably would have been raids and conflicts and fighting between the all white areas of the U.S. and then the all black areas of the U.S., because it would have really put that tension and division between the two races. But it would have been a huge step for freeing them and giving them their own life, because it wouldn't have meant they would have had to jump into the sharecropping, and they wouldn't have had to still been tied to so much of the white landowners' power and influence over them. Now, Section 3 of it says each family shall have a plot of no more than 40 acres of tillable ground, and when it borders on some water channel with no more than 800 feet of waterfront, in the possession of which land the military authorities will afford them protection until such time as they can protect themselves, or until Congress shall regulate their title. So Section 3 establishes the guidelines of land per family and how much water that land would have access to if it was on a waterfront. And then also establishes what I said before with the military being able to be in there, but for their protection. And they would have protected and prevented a lot of these white people who were outside of the region from coming in and causing any aggression or any issues with the African Americans that would live within this specified region. And it would have allowed that until they could build up their own strong statehood, possibly be even their own nation at some point, depending on how far it would have lasted, or until Congress would have, like it says, regulated their title. That was only for the land. So the 40 acres and a mule concept originally was only for land and for the family. And then later on, once it was established, because it was established and put into place, and that land was stripped from previous white landowners within the region and given to African Americans or freedmen and freed families. And then later, the order and idea came, well, now let's have all of these white landowners provide them a mule so that they can have a stronger tool to till ground and lay crops faster and harvest quicker and whatnot. But after Abraham Lincoln's death and the inauguration of President Johnson, the land was returned to the original owners of the property, and the African Americans were dispersed back throughout the South. Some went north. Johnson was a favorite of the South, and he made it in to office, and he essentially reversed the entire 40 acres and a mule concept and re-released the damaging effects of African Americans under white power and white supremacy. The 40 acres and a mule kind of created a bubble or a shield of protection for African Americans to make their attempt at equal power and representation and equal economic capabilities within the United States. That was the purpose, was to make them, or at least initiate the strides to be taken for their equality. Had 40 acres and a mule stood, nobody really knows what could have happened, of course, because it didn't stand, but had it stood, we can presume that they would have maybe achieved equality in a lot of the oppression and problems that we see today and we saw throughout the civil rights movement and everything would have possibly be kind of pushed aside. It also, in theory, could have created more tension, like I said before, and divided the populations even more, because it would have kept them separate and not have intermingled them. But nobody can really say what would have happened. At the time, it seemed only fair that this is what should have been done. But obviously that's not there anymore and hasn't been for well over 100 years. And there's not really any saying what could have been. We can only take the situation we have now and try and work on that. But what is all of this, all of these, the black codes, the Jim Crow laws, the sharecropping, the peonage, the 40 acres and a mule, what do these things tell us in regards to today? So obviously the black codes, Jim Crow laws, peonage, sharecropping, all that were established after slavery was deemed illegal. They were established to limit African American lifestyles, restrict them from economic success, and restrain them from any kind of power, politically, economically, socially, at all, and are kind of fundamental elements in the digging of the hole that you see the current African American population in which they struggle to even get out of, or even get the basic human necessities of things like food and healthcare on a regular basis. It also shows us that how the legal systems were set up and the political systems were set up throughout by the southern states introducing these black codes, that white people really just wanted to force them to act out, to unleash harsh punishment and force them back into essentially legalized slavery. You saw them just wanting to do whatever they could to maintain a grip on slave society and the economic prosperity that they experienced and their family lineage, the white family lineages had experienced while slavery was legal in the United States and the Americas in general. So the thing that's important to draw from this, and what I said well before we discussed it all, was that oppression and the horrific elements of discrimination and segregation and racism and all that did not die when slavery was abolished. It continued on evermore and still continues on, even despite, and because the civil rights movement did not put an end to it either. You know, the abolishment of slavery and the civil rights movement and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act and things like that, really, they're major strides, but it doesn't mean that there aren't still problems and still injustices and inequality within the United States, because there's always something that can be fought for, because how our society is set up just holds our African American population down and makes it, because of all of the accruing damage of all of these previous events, is what's continuously holding them down. And it might seem difficult and sometimes even impossible to make these strides, but as long as every year, or taking advantage of every day and every minute to make a change and make things better, then we have to, because with enough change can come the possibility and shed some light on a more likely equal world within the United States. But going on from post-slavery as well, and just things between these early stages of the black codes and whatnot, there's stuff that goes on around World War II, and we can talk about voting rights and getting into the civil rights movement that are important as well. I have looked into this concept discussed by a man named Robert Blauner. I think I'm pronouncing his last name right, but Robert Blauner, and he discusses what's called internal colonialism, and the Google definition of that is the uneven effects of economic development on a regional basis, otherwise known as uneven development, as a result of the exploitation of minority groups within a wider society and leading to political and economic inequalities between regions within a state. So, internal colonialism basically means the exploitation of certain populations and the moving of certain populations into certain areas, and once they're there, kind of holding them down. So internal colonialism ties in with Native Americans in the United States. Currently, we see internal colonialism in ICE and detention centers for Hispanic and Latino immigrants primarily, and then internal colonialism on the distinct, segregated and regions of especially urban America. You see places like Chicago and Milwaukee who are severely separated, and there's fine lines within these cities where you get onto one side and it's primarily poor African American regions, and how it's been this internal colonialism has set it up so that those can exist. And then because of the stigma with African Americans as being people who commit more crimes and whatnot, they don't commit more crimes. That would be impossible because their population is far less than that of white people in the United States. So the fact that they commit more crimes on a statistical basis is not even possible. I mean, it could be, but it's very unlikely because of the population differences. But now they say, well, the amount of white people, ratio-wise, they say, well, it's higher. But because of how our society is constructed, African Americans have been held down to poverty, as I've been explaining through all of these historical events already. But because of that, crime exists in poorer areas and breeds in poorer areas. Therefore, police go into those poorer areas often. Even though severe crimes still happen anywhere, African Americans get arrested more because they have been forcibly placed within these poorer regions of America throughout this internal colonialism process. And because of it, police go into their areas more and find more reasons to arrest them, because when you're held down, and it's almost as if you're in an inescapable area where it's too difficult because of lack of funding and lack of equality and the ability to have access to college and whatnot because of prior events taking effect on you through the doing of white oppression, then it's easier to try and just do what you can to support. I mean, most people, when put in a situation, are going to do whatever they can to keep their family safe and provide for their families. So that's why you see crime, drug sales, violence really take place within these regions, because it's all been sparked from people trying to take advantage of their environment in order to do the best they can. And in America, the best you can do is be financially stable. It's not about really being a good person. It's about making as much money as you possibly can. And that kind of dives into probably a topic for later discussion in regards to capitalism and how it really fuels the strict desire for money and valuable goods. And it's all materialistic because of it. And due to that, that's plays into the aspects of breeding crime in these poor regions, because when they can't escape because they don't have access to fair education or funding or the ability to really get out and get a good job, then you see, because the bottom line is if you don't get caught, selling drugs is far more profitable than working at McDonald's or your local gas station. So you can make thousands, tens of thousands of dollars through the sales of drugs, even though it damages you yourself and your community. a lot of the times they're just trying to better their families and their lives. And most people, and especially white people, they do what they do for their family. And a lot of them say, well, I only care about me and my family and the ones that I love and my close friends. So I'm, going to do the best I can for all of them. Well, it's the same for African Americans in poor regions. They say there's higher crime rates there, but it's just because of the society around them holding them down. So yeah, internal colonialism, very important thing to discuss, and I would highly recommend taking the time on your own to really looking into that and researching about it much more, because it doesn't just exist in the United States. It exists in a lot of other regions of the world, and it's a very important and unique concept to look at. Another thing we could discuss about as we get closer to like the civil rights movement is persistent issues from right away after the abolishment of slavery and the making of all freed African Americans to citizens are voting rights and issues. So up until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed due to the civil rights movement, there were poll taxes, literacy tests, proof of citizenship requirements, documentation requirements, and it was more of those for African Americans than for whites. There was also intimidation and threats, and even fraudulent polling, so destruction of voting slips, purposeful miscounts, and this was all happening when African Americans became more active in voting. So all of these loopholes after they became citizens were discovered by local communities and everything in order to keep down African Americans from having a voice politically. These poll taxes were often unaffordable because of the poverty that African Americans experienced from the time slavery was abolished. Literacy tests, which a lot of, obviously, as we know and discussed earlier, a lot of African Americans couldn't read or write due to just the lack of education that America refused to give them. Proof of citizenship, even though they were made citizens, a lot of them didn't get proof of that and didn't possess that on them, or were waiting on it or something like that. And just more documents in general, birth certificates, things like that, would be required of them at the polls, where that wasn't the case for white people. Also, just in general, you would see African Americans wouldn't want to show up to polls because the white people would threaten them or intimidate them and things like that when they would get there. And then the ones who were brave enough and bold enough to get pushed through all of that and get there and vote and were able to actually vote, it didn't even really matter because their votes would often be placed into separate boxes or something that would just be thrown out, or that there would be fraudulent changing of their voting slips or destruction of them, or they would just intentionally miscount to favor the political candidates that were more for continuously holding down the African American populations and keeping up the white supremacy and racism in the United States. So obviously everything we're talking about is just so negative and horrible to look at in the overall treatment historically in the U.S. on African Americans. And the thing is despite all of this treatment, African Americans would still go out and they still were great people, and for everything that was done to them, they treated white people fairly and with respect and nicely, often a lot of times because they had to, otherwise in fear of being killed or their family being hurt or something like that, but just because they were also great people. And a prime example of how, despite everything that was done to them, how well and how amazing African American people were to America as a whole comes in World War II. So 1.2 million African Americans laid their life on the line for the service of the United States in World War II. And we're talking about putting their life on the line and being willing to serve for a country that segregated them, within the military and back at home. And with the ability to go and fight for their country, a lot of them wanted to take the opportunity to prove white people wrong, that they were of value and that they could work together to better the world and hopefully try and take that message back into the States once the war ended. Despite serving bravely and being key factors in major victories for the United States and the Allied forces, African Americans were still mistreated at war as much as they were at home by their fellow brothers in arms. So a couple prime examples of these great victories and major elements in the brave serving of them would be 1,700 African Americans were the first to put their boots on the ground during the D-Day invasion at Normandy. So debatably the most famous event in World War II would be the D-Day invasion at Normandy, right up there with the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and of course the end of the war and the beginning of the war and things like that. But D-Day is by far one of the most world-renowned and famous events. But 1,700 African Americans were the first to put their boots on the ground at D-Day and lead the charge, which they were on the front lines, meaning they were some of the first to make pushes and also some of the first to be killed. As sadly, but they fought bravely and were willing to put their lives on the line and be the first ones to lead that charge. Now, probably one of the most incredible feats of African Americans in World War II would be the Red Tails or the fighter pilots. This was like a regiment of African, since the armed forces were segregated, it was an African American only pilot or Air Force group. And they led hundreds and hundreds of successful missions. Bomber units who were of like high priority would request these Red Tails to cover them on important missions because of how highly praised and the level of skill and success that they had. That was probably the most progressive thing that happened between the segregation of the armed forces would be white soldiers wanting to fly with these Red Tails because of how good they were. But that just shows you how that really skin color doesn't mean shit because, and I mean, if you haven't figured that out yet already, then I mean, you're probably just a lost soul at this point. But these Red Tails were so profound, so successful, and such a key part of the American forces. And the sad thing is they have gotten a lot of historical credit and a lot of people do know about them, but probably not as much as they should. And that's partly due to their skin color and who they were as a regiment, which would be an African-American one. But the irony of World War II, in a nutshell, is that the United States helped dismantle debatably the most racist and ethnocentric human being and military force to ever exist. And with that being Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich of Germany in World War II. Debatably the most racist and ethnocentric group of people to ever exist. But the United States helped dismantle that despite having a segregated military of its own and a homeland with a brutal amount of racism that would continuously go unchecked and still continuously goes unchecked. That's so ironic because they deemed what they were doing, the Germans were doing to the Jews as so wrong, yet millions and millions of African Americans at home are treated, of course not to the level that the Jewish population was in the Holocaust, but treated very poorly back at home. So that's just somewhat of an ironic aspect of that. Continuing on and getting more into the civil rights movement itself. So, of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was kind of the crowning achievement of activists and measures taken in the mid-20th century towards racial equality. Now that the civil rights movement and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 desegregated schools, made employer discrimination illegal, and public discrimination illegal as well. So this was obviously a huge push, along with the Voting Rights Act of 65, were huge strides for the African American population. But like everything for their history, within African American history in the United States, loopholes have been found. So yes, it desegregated schools and made public discrimination illegal and employer discrimination illegal. But now you have an African American sitting in an interview and they would just be told it's not because of who they are, it's because they're not qualified to have that job. There's always loopholes. You don't have enough education, you don't have enough experience, and then they would go hire somebody who had far less but was white. And so there were loopholes, and then they desegregated schools, but schools that eventually had, and more urban schools that have a higher population of African Americans. And we see this today, and in a later episode for this mini season about African American oppression in the United States, I will definitely be getting involved in discussing the education system and the flaws within that, especially in regards to African American people. But on a quick note on that is that even though the Civil Rights Act of 64 desegregated schools, you see a lack of funding, resources, and proper education and information being sent into the public schools in urbanized centers that have a higher African American population than that of many other public school systems. So kind of connecting this all in with elements of today, racism holds a strong stigma, and of course whites have placed a stigma upon African Americans and have pushed their views onto their children. So the important thing to note about all of these events is they have fueled racism, and the black codes, slavery has kept racism alive throughout the generations. And the stigma placed on African Americans, looking at higher criminal rates because of poverty and things like that, and tying it in with modern society, whites place this stigma upon African Americans, and the biggest problem of it all is they push that stigma onto their children. So then children grow up and they experience this talk of African Americans being deemed basically evil and white people good. It makes that goes into children, and when that sets root in a young child's mind, I mean, during prime developmental years, that becomes a hard thing to shake, because it is a rooted since birth bias and perspective. And that is one of the major things that current activism and progress towards equality have to debunk, and that's the spreading of the message that African Americans are different in a bad way from white people. Pushing those views onto children, and then of course going through the public education system, the public education system does not tackle racism as well as it should, and discuss it as well as it should, and tell historical sides as well from the oppressed as well as it should, because the education system is going to use the excuse of history is told from the side of the victor, and in the United States the victor is white people. Without your own research, without college education, and without furthering your own knowledge, you're not going to shed a bias such as racism towards African Americans. A lot of the most racist of white people tend to be only high school educated people, if you look at it statistically, and also pull elements in the political polls. The ones who tend to vote right-wing and conservative are ones who only hold high school educations, and those who have a college degree tend to vote more Democratic and left-wing. And that is because I would say that college really opens up your eyes and your mind to various perspectives throughout the world, and really debunks personal biases and separates races about separate races and cultures. It educates students on what it means to be equal and to be informed on current issues within the United States and the world. College also, and this is not just college, but just your own research into these topics, also helps people to understand privilege and more in-depth concepts about the world and how it works around them and what it means to grow up in privilege, especially in the United States. The thing about public ed and just the high school, middle school, elementary school system is it teaches broad. And now I was going to be a teacher for 2 years, and I was going in it with the primary reason to make a difference in children's lives and spread different messages and try and teach in a way that wasn't the typical way of high school. Obviously, that's within the limits that a school would have allowed me to do it, but public education, in my words, teaches broad, non-useful knowledge and often solidifies many privileged mentalities as well as racism within it. Like I said, I will be discussing college and the education system in America in a later episode here, but it's important to note in regards to all of these historical elements being discussed, because none of this, a lot of the stuff that I've told you, people have heard about it in high school and whatnot, but a lot of it isn't taught thoroughly in depth and from the side of African Americans or other oppressed populations. You just hear it from, well, this is how it was. And it was the abolishment of slavery was a huge stride. That's all you really know, but you don't really see how the effects of slavery still live on within. You're starting to see that more in public education, I believe, but I think as younger teachers enter the school systems. But overall, I would say it teaches fairly broad, non-useful knowledge. Yes, the basics do help when you get to college and with some things, but really having, of course, everyone can argue about what schools teach and whatnot, but I would say overall it's fairly broad and only useful to an extent. Also, connecting everything in with today, the economic effects are huge. By cutting off access to many financial gains for the African American communities, I would say that it has made it difficult for them to achieve higher status on their own in modern American markets and modern American society and the current political atmosphere. With that being said, it's difficult without the help of activism and protesting and the want for change for African American communities to really achieve any sense of equality. Overall, African Americans do the same, if not more work compared to whites. But statistically, they get paid less, fired and laid off more, and treated less fairly within these jobs. And in general, they're often snubbed out of job opportunities, and it's not because they're unqualified, but it is because of their skin color. And that's going back to that loophole of, despite the Civil Rights Act of 1964 making it illegal for discrimination in the workplace and discrimination when hiring someone on for a job, that loophole is still there where they use the justification that a person is not qualified enough, but really the underlying factor is it's that because of their skin color. Full equality and change can't happen until racism and these prior biases and these perspectives are eliminated from our society. Once the people hiring at jobs have no quarrel or no negative opinion about African Americans, once the people in power have no negative connotations about African Americans, once racism is predominantly wiped from our society, that's when equality can begin to set in. So change needs to be made and strides to end things like police brutality that we're seeing today and economic inequalities and disparities within our country. Pushing for those is important, but I would say the most important thing of all of this, when you really boil it down and look at it, is that you need to rid the country of poor prejudices towards African American people, racism, and the overall mindset that African Americans are different in a negative and bad way comparative to white people. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the first episode of History Rewritten. Next week, I'm going to jump more into, we're going to start with the criminal justice system, and or next episode, I should say, we'll start with the criminal justice system and the police brutality and just the large disparities and inequalities in regards to our police, courts, and the overall criminal justice system. Please go to the links on the YouTube page and donate, sign petitions, further your knowledge, do some of that research as well, because that stuff will really help in shaping and formulating new biases, new opinions that are more positive and for the betterment of African American life within the United States. Once again, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I hope you plan on tuning in for further episodes as we continue with History Rewritten. Thank you, and have a good one.